Hi there, and welcome to our live event. I am your host, John Ivison, and I am joined today by a very special guest, Mark Norman. Mark retired from the Royal Canadian Navy with the rank of Vice Admiral in 2019, having been Vice Chief of the Defence Staff, the second highest appointment in the Canadian Armed Forces. He's currently Senior Defence Strategist at Ottawa-based Samuel Associates, and I can't think of anybody better qualified to help us understand the military aspects of the new geopolitical landscape and Canada's place in that dangerous world. So, Mark, welcome.
Thanks, John. It's great to be with you, and I'm looking forward to our discussion today.
So, firing away, Mark, you've been watching events unfold in Ukraine. It's day 86. Have you been surprised at the stubbornness of the resistance and of the apparent ineptitude of the Russians?
Yeah, well, yes and no. And I think let's talk about the Russian side of this first. I did not believe that this was going to happen, and I'm not alone in that view, and I think it'll be useful in the context of our conversation going forward. But nonetheless, I, like many, I think overestimated the competence and the capacity of the Russian military. I grew up decades of the Cold War and then after, where we saw the Russians as a significant military capability that was to be respected, perhaps not feared, but certainly respected. And what we've seen, to your question, has been a variety of indicators that they really have either lost their way or they weren't what we thought they were. And just a few specific areas of examples. So I think the first thing is that the whole planning effort is completely bewildering. I'm not an expert in land campaigns, but I have a number of friends who are, and collectively we're just shaking our heads. The basic principles of warfare just don't seem to have been applied from the outset. And we've seen a variety of, adjustments and changes on the fly that have been mysterious, to say the least. So the plan, to be blunt, appears to have been a pretty shitty plan from the outset. The second thing is their capacity with respect to the fundamentals of logistics and supporting movement on the battlefield just seem to be clearly lacking. This is an area of important professionalism for any military, and they just they appear to have been caught short in a number of ways, where they outran their supply lines, or they just weren't prepared to deal with the movements on the ground that they put into their plan from the outset. And there's a whole bunch of things, but the third one, and it's most important to how you frame the question, is the issue of the Ukrainian resistance. And I think the Russians, and I would suggest a number in the West, perhaps not those who were intimately involved with training the Ukrainian armed forces, but many others underestimated the ability of the Ukrainians. Not so much their tenacity and their heart and their passion to fight, but their actual competence on the battlefield. And it's been incredibly impressive. And I think there are some, notwithstanding the terrible things that continue to happen and the atrocities that we're seeing, I think there's some very significant lessons that are being observed as this unfolds. So those are my sort of opening thoughts, if you will, in response to your first question.
So the Defence Minister, Anita Anand, said last week that we're entering a dangerous new phase of the war. It would seem to me that the danger may well spring from that ineptitude and the disappointing results that the Russians have encountered. Do you think that leads Putin to get even more desperate and perhaps escalate?
Yeah, I think that is a unfortunately a likely and reasonable conclusion in the context of where we find ourselves. Look, things have not gone well. You've reported, many have reported, I just commented, and this puts Putin in particular in a situation where, you know, he's desperate to find some sort of win, and at all cost. And those are certainly the indicators that we've had over the last 80 some days. And yes, there's a sense of desperation here, and that's never a good thing, especially when you're dealing with the kinds of capabilities that the Russians have, and notwithstanding the fact that they've taken enormous casualties, not just human casualties, but material and the attrition has been enormous. But they still have a fairly significant inventory of nasty capabilities, and they have demonstrated a willingness to act in ways which are completely contrary to how professional, ethically centered Western militaries would choose to behave on the battlefield. And so there's two dimensions of that risk, and that's what I sense the minister is saying, but I'm not exactly sure.
Are you? I mean, how do you see it ending? Are you optimistic, or do you think that worst case scenarios could come into play?
You know, that's a tough question. I continue to hold out a significant degree of hope, but that hope is, you know, is tempered by the realities. I believe that, you know, that the eastern provinces, the Donbass, as it's been referred to, I think that that's become, you know, the critical focus. I have no doubt that the Russian strategy here will be to try and appear to have won something in those areas, to have a physical corridor, access to the salt water in the Black Sea, back to the issues of the Crimea, all this stuff that's been discussed elsewhere. I think that's what this ends up looking like. Of course, the Ukrainians are not going to accept that. And I think we're already starting to see indications that, you know, the large scale interactions that we've seen over the last few weeks are now, it's not that they're not reducing per se, but they're changing, they're evolving. And I see a protracted, almost, I don't want to call it a guerrilla type activity because it's their country, and they're defending it. But I see the Ukrainians continuing to badger the Russians in these smaller engagements. And then there will be some sort of discussion around what the political solution might look like in the eastern part of the country. And I don't know where that goes, and I'm not quite sure how it's going to play out. I'm sorry I can't be more specific, but I don't want to guess.
For sure. Let's turn to Canada's role. I mean, you already alluded to something, which was the training mission, which where Canada trained, I don't know how many Ukrainians, but it does seem to help professionalize a force that was probably in dire need of it back after the invasion of Crimea in 2014. But I think subsequently, it's fair to say that the federal government's initial response was slow and rather half-hearted. Do you think we've picked up our game? We've sent artillery, we've sent the promised armoured cars, there've been various other bits and bobs of equipment. Do you think we should be doing more? I mean, there've been talk of Harpoon anti-sea missiles, sending some of our LAVs, for example, the light armoured vehicles. How are we doing on that front, do you think, especially when compared to some of our allies?
Yeah, so I think, and I'm going to be as fair as I can be, but I do believe, to the premise of your question, I do believe that we were, in nautical terms, astern of station. You know, we were behind where we should have been. I think there's probably a genuine sense of surprise and bewilderment, disbelief, you could almost argue, and that we were really slow to get moving. Okay, so fine. You know, we saw that in the pandemic. We've seen that elsewhere. Sadly, this is a recurring example of the fact that we seem to be slow to realize the strategic significance of these major events. But okay, we get caught up, and now the questions have become over the last few months, what is reasonable for Canada to do? And this is where we get into a bit of a challenge. I do believe we should have done more and could be doing more, but there is a practical challenge here, which I don't defend, but I can't deny, and that is the fact that we don't have a lot of tools in the toolbox. And so the options that are available to this government are severely constrained, notwithstanding whether they're prepared to be imaginative or innovative in terms of how they either come up with or implement the options. They don't have a lot of options. And so I think that is concerning. And it's concerning not just in the context of our ability to respond to this specific event, but I think it's deeply concerning in terms of where we find ourselves more globally and strategically as we look at how things may or may not unfold, and not just in this particular situation, but as we look more broadly around the world. I mean, the world is sadly a nasty place, and we tend in Canada to look at the way we would like the world to be as opposed to the way the world really is. And that's my long answer to your question.
Well, I think, I mean, you and I have talked about this before, that Canada doesn't really have a culture that is overly concerned about national security or defence. I mean, I think it's fair to say this government has had a complete lack of interest in defence to the point of negligence, unless it touched on social issues. I mean, you only have to look at Anita Anand's mandate letter, which essentially talked about one demand to build a modern armed force, but the rest of it was about the need for culture change. I get a sense that it is changing a little bit, though. I mean, there is a sense of some sense of urgency.
Well, yeah, look, I think there's a realpolitik at play here. And I think that notwithstanding whatever ideological basis this government or any other looks at defense in general, the realities of living in the world we live in start to play. The Canada-U.S. relationship and the expectations of our closest and strongest ally and neighbor can't be ignored, and they start to permeate some of the decisions that governments have to make. The whole issue around the internal challenges with respect to the culture inside the military, I mean, those are pressing issues, and they can't be ignored or denied. But notwithstanding how prominent they may be in the paperwork, if you will, the reality is that we don't live in a bubble, and I think what you're starting to see is perhaps a reluctant recognition of the fact that defense is important. The challenge in all of this is there a genuine belief that defense in and of itself is important, or is it perhaps a more transactional view that it's important that we pretend that defense is important in order to pursue these other objectives? And that concerns me, because then, and that has been the history of many defense decisions in Canadian history, certainly modern history, is that, we will do just enough in order to satisfy whatever the expectations are, but we're not really committed to this as a fundamental concept, and we don't really see the need. And that's a bit provocative, but that's a view that obviously I've developed over decades.
Let's come back to the relationship with the US in a few minutes. You were talking about the strategic need for review. I mean, the strong, secure, and engaged defence policy came out in 2017. It does seem outdated already, given the new weapons that are available, the invasion of Ukraine. You proposed in a paper with Andrew Leslie last year a pivot towards Indo-Pacific, even establishing a base there with a strong naval component. Do you think that we need to do a complete overhaul of what we're doing and where we're doing it and at what cost we're doing it?
Well, I mean, okay, so let's start with the premise of the defense policy, strong, secure, engaged. Look, every government comes in Certainly, the track record is there. They want to put their stamp on defense, and that's a good thing. And the reality is that they never fully capture the realities, and they're always going to be lagging behind somewhat what is happening. There has been for quite some time an underlying recognition of the fact that the nature of global security is changing and has been changing. Go back, Cold War, post-Cold War, 9/11, post 9/11, and then we see the rise of China. And of course, then you come along and you have something like Ukraine, which becomes an enormously significant strategic event, but in many respects, and I don't mean this in a dismissive way, it becomes a bit of a distraction. It wasn't predicted, and then all of a sudden, the lesson is, well, you can't predict the future. Well, no, you can't, but you can certainly look at where the areas of concern are, and that's where we were coming from, was to say, look, notwithstanding all these things that were happening, and that predated the invasion of Ukraine, we really need to start looking, in Canadian context, we need to start looking west. We need to start looking at what China is doing, the plan that they have in place, and how that is of significant concern to global security for a variety of reasons, which we can touch on. And so, it's always time to review our national defense and security priorities, assuming that we're taking them seriously. And so I'm pleased to see the government acknowledging that there is a need to redo this. I'm not sure how committed they will or won't be, and I'm also concerned that it can't just be another sort of superficial view. Obviously I'm on a bit of a soapbox here, but I really think we need to start embracing the fundamental essence of what national security means, and how we behave on the global stage. We are no longer isolated in the way that we once were. If anything, the pandemic has demonstrated that, perhaps in a different way that most people wouldn't necessarily correlate with security. But we need to really start thinking about what's going on in the world and how we want to defend our interests. Fundamentally, is what this is all about.
I mean, the criticism I heard about strong security engagement, it didn't really offer any priorities on behalf of the government. Were we most concerned about continental defense, or about China, or about, I guess, Europe?
Yeah.
You're suggesting the China component is preeminent.
Well, this is so. Yes and no. I think it's a huge concern, and I don't think we're taking it seriously. I mean, we finally had an announcement. I believe it was an announcement, or whether it was a leak, I'm not sure, that we're gonna make a decision on 5G. I mean, that's just a classic example of how these things just don't seem to resonate in the way that certainly I believe they should. But this isn't about me, but I think there's others who would share that view. So yeah, the problem with expressing priorities, and this is why I think governments are reluctant to do it, is a couple of reasons. One, that they might be fearful that they get them wrong, and then they'll be criticized for them. And two, if you lay them out as priorities and then you don't actually address them as priorities, well, then you become open to criticism. So you want to be, as from a purely government policy perspective, you want to be as specific as necessary, but not necessarily specific, to paraphrase Churchill. You know what I mean? Yeah.
I mean, you mentioned the Huawei decision there, the 5G decision came down yesterday. Do you think that makes any difference to our cybersecurity, or was it merely window dressing?
No, it's an important decision. The mechanics of it, and I'm not an expert in this domain, but I understand the security implications of this. I mean, we're going to drag this out over several years. It's a sort of a classic Canadian approach. But yeah, no, it does make a difference because it's an enormous technical vulnerability, and this is, we should have been on this from the beginning. But that's a whole other discussion. The Chinese are blatant and unapologetic about the mechanisms that they use to either spy on or influence and manipulate those who they want to influence and manipulate. And the thought that we would even consider having Chinese technology with all of its embedded spyware and everything else as an integral component of our national security infrastructure is just preposterous and irresponsible. But anyway, we got to the right decision. It just took us a long
3 years, but yeah.
Yeah.
Another area that there does seem to be imminent movement is continental defence. Minister Hernandez talked about bold and aggressive action. And there's even talk about Canada joining a US intercontinental ballistic missile defence, which is something I covered back in 2004 or 5, I think. What do you expect to see there?
Well, yeah, it's interesting. And I'm encouraged by the language out of the minister. And I was just participating in a conference yesterday here in Ottawa on this broader subject of continental defense. This is a bigger problem than I think even the government has perhaps recognized or at least acknowledged publicly. This isn't just about updating a few older pieces of equipment that have been around since the 1980s that we associate with North warning systems and the like. This is about a fundamental relook at how we should be a reliable partner to the United States are actually contributing to the collective defense of the continent and ensuring that, the United States is not going to be vulnerable because of something we have not done properly in Canada. And fundamentally, that's what this comes down to. And the scale and scope of this challenge, I mean, basically it goes from space to the seabed, and it includes the domains of cyber, it's a significant undertaking. Do I believe that we are going to be capable of, eating this elephant, if I can use that term? I'm not sure. I'm a little concerned. And do I believe that there will be sufficient appetite to accept the size of the elephant that we have to deal with? Again, I'm not sure, but the indicators are positive, and we'll see. I think what we're probably going to see here is what I would characterize as, the classic Canadian incremental approach. We'll try to cover a bunch of the key areas, and then we'll see what happens. But we've got to deliver on this stuff. And the other challenge with all of this is that, and I've commented on this publicly as well, there is no point in just adding more stuff to a shopping list of things that haven't been addressed already. So we've got to figure out how we actually start delivering on all of these commitments, as opposed to just making more of them and putting them on a list.
But this seems to fit into what you were talking about earlier, and I know that you've expressed concerns in the past that were being seen as irrelevant from Washington. This does seem to be a response in order to get other stuff. It's not an end in and of itself. It's because if we don't do this, then tariffs on electric vehicles or whatever will impact on us. Do you think that there is enough appetite? I think it's a 40-60 cost sharing, but it sounds a hell of an expensive proposition to try and protect against hypersonic missiles, for example.
Yeah, so you're right, and I think what we're going to see here is a very, I'll be generous and call it a sophisticated dance with respect to how much is enough to demonstrate the level of commitment that will satisfy, perhaps, temporarily or whatever, those in Washington. But there will be some legitimate acceptance of responsibility. Okay, we need to do these things anyway. They're important to us, not just for those other reasons. But it will be a modest indication of commitment. But this is where your viewers and others, the scope of the problem is enormous, and so it will be tens of billions of dollars, and it will be an eye-watering bill, and people will legitimately have sticker shock. And then for somebody like me to say, yeah, but you know what, we're not really doing everything that's required. And so we should be embracing things like being part of ballistic missile defense. We should be helping, because these things are as much symbolic to the United States as they are actually materially useful. And so, there are ways we can be smart about this that aren't just self-serving, but that actually help solve the significant problem that is the emerging threats to North America.
And how do we change that perception in Washington? Is it simply by picking up more of the tab for NATO and NORAD? I mean, because in addition to what we're talking about here, there is a demand for us to increase defense spending to 2%. Which,
yeah, there's two polarized views of this, and for the purpose of the discussion, let's just put them out there. One view would be, look, Washington's never going to be satisfied, and we're a sovereign nation, and we get to make our own decisions, and basically we'll do what we want to do. That's one view. And then the other view is the extreme interpretation of what I've been suggesting, which is that we have these security responsibilities irrespective of our relationship with Washington, and so we need to do as much as we possibly can because it's the right thing to do. Whether we get any credit for it or not should be irrelevant to the discussion. Well, the reality is that somewhere in the middle, this is all going to fall out, and the government of the day will be the ones who make the decisions at this particular moment in time with respect to what happens. I don't think Canada will ever openly commit at this particular point in time, anyway, I shouldn't say ever, in this specific timeline, openly commit to actually putting the resources in play to meet the 2% target, whether we believe what we said a few years ago or not. But I think we will demonstrate that we're moving towards the 2% target in order to demonstrate a commitment. But I go back to, these are huge problems that have tens of billions or hundreds of billions of dollars of cost associated with them. So I'm less concerned about the percentage. I am concerned about what we're actually doing. Whether Washington is satisfied or not, at least we should be doing the right thing for the right reasons.
A subplot in all of this is that we're clearly, one way or another, going to spend an awful lot of money on some of this very sophisticated technology. And I've heard fears that American protectionism means that most of the innovation and investment will be done in the US and that Canada will be frozen out. Is that a legitimate concern? And if so, what can the government do about that?
It does have some legitimacy, but look, there's some incredible technological innovation happening here in Canada, and whether it has a direct security nexus or not, there is some great applications to the broader security space, if you will, defense and security space. I don't believe we're going to be frozen out in that respect. I do believe that it's very difficult for Canadian industry to compete. That's why making sure that we focus the investments in the right areas and that we have a robust policy in place that enables Canadian industry, to do what we can where we can, and where we can be a leader, we'll be a recognized leader. But we shouldn't compete in areas where we don't have a chance in hell, for a variety of reasons, including the fact that we can't necessarily get access to the technology. So I think you're going to see a lot of US-based weapon military technology, because that's fundamentally the way things are wired these days. This is a huge, interoperability is a huge consideration, and you can't ignore it. I mean, look at the fighter decision. That just makes sense. But there's a whole conversation that doesn't get a lot of heat and light, which is around where we make the right investments in Canada, what we can and should be doing, and being smart about it. It's not really a full answer to your question, but
good enough. It's good enough. Let's just turn to staffing levels. I mean, today, Justice Louise Arbour is going to bring down her report on the sexual misconduct scandal, I guess it is. It's a time of unprecedented demand for the forces. I mean, who would have thought we would have had soldiers in nursing homes, but we did. Yet there is a shortage of staff. There's 10,000 regular and reserve troops short, I think 1,000 sailors. Partly 71% of those forces are white men, and the majority of Canadians are not interested in joining the forces.
Yeah.
These things I don't think are unrelated. Is it important to make the forces more relevant and more attractive to Canadians as a potential career?
Absolutely. What you've just laid out by definition to those, it's not even specifically a military issue. This is by definition what would be described as a wicked problem, whereby the level of complexity associated with how these things interconnect, where you go in and you try to fix one element of the problem, and then you create a second and third order impact somewhere else that just creates another problem. And yes, they are all interrelated. There is fundamentally no question. Even back in the period of Afghanistan, when a lot of people were joining up for a variety of reasons, the reputation of the armed forces was arguably at a I won't say all-time high, but certainly from the perspective of my almost 40 years in uniform, at a significant high point. Even then, the structure of the armed forces was fundamentally flawed with respect to the numbers of people who were actually in, the numbers of those people who were actually available, how the structures were set up, and that it's a very complicated equation that I don't want to get into here, but it has been out of balance for quite some time. And then, yes, to your point, you now layer on top of that an incredibly disturbing set of very public issues associated with the inner culture of the armed forces, and I'm not surprised that people are uninterested. I'm not surprised that the armed forces is struggling to recruit people, and sadly, I'm not surprised that it continued the demographic, if you will, continues to demonstrate what is I'll just call it an older version of Canada than Canada is currently on the surface. So, and we can talk about any one of those things, but getting this stuff sorted out is essential to moving forward, because without it, people are just going to They're just going to be completely disinterested, and they're not going to believe. And that's the issue. One of the fundamental issues that's at play here is that issues of trust and credibility.
Right.
And so who wants to be part of an organization where you have those perceptions? There are many in the organization who would say that legitimately that it's a great organization filled with amazing people, and that is true, but it also is an organization that is struggling with its reputation.
Right. I mean, you did mention that when the forces were engaged in Afghanistan, the culture, which is disinterested in the military, changes somewhat. There is a little bit more interest, and maybe that helps resolve some of the issue. Maybe the forces become a little bit more attractive when the focus is on them and people are concentrating on the good things they're doing rather than the less good things.
Yeah, I agree, and I'm sure there's people who are much smarter in terms of the human dimension of this than I am. But you know, the other thing as well is that sadly, a lot of the issues that have come to light in the last sort of 18 months or so were ever present throughout that period. So, you know, there's a flip side to that, which says that, you know, notwithstanding the great things that the organization is doing and continues to do, let's be honest, you know, you can't deny the fact that there are some issues. And I honestly believe that even though this has been really ugly and very painful and it's hurt a lot of people, I think that this is a defining moment. I look forward to seeing what Justice Arbour has to say. I look forward to seeing how the government implements whatever is recommended. And I believe that this is a turning point, or should be a turning point, in terms of moving forward as a national institution, a vital national institution. The problem is it took decades to screw this up. And so it would be naive and irresponsible to believe that it can be fixed quickly within the mandate of one government or one minister. You can't turn the organization around on the dime, but you know, it is going the right. Meanwhile, to your point, chronically short of people who are the essence of how things get done, and notwithstanding, you know, procurement problems and issues with respect to inventory of equipment and all those kinds of things. If you don't have the people to get the job done, and you're leaning on the same people over and over again, they get tired, they get frustrated, and they leave. And that's also what we're seeing.
Right. I mean, how many times have we seen disaster relief and well, pandemic relief as well? I don't suppose that's what people signed up for in the first place.
No, everybody joins for their own reason, right? In the same way that everybody will ultimately leave for their own reason. But no, you don't train an armed forces to do disaster relief and pandemic support. You train them to engage in combat, to fight an enemy, and ultimately to win. The great thing about an organization like the armed forces is that if you can train them to do those higher end things, then you can employ them in a variety of other capabilities when there isn't a pressing demand for them to be, you know, forward deployed, you know, either for a deterrence mission or whatever the case may be. But with an overly taxed organization that is woefully short of people, you start making trade-offs, and those trade-offs come ultimately on the backs of the women and men who are in uniform, and they can only take that so many times, and their families ultimately can only put up with it so many times, irrespective of the other issues associated with the cultural issues that need to be sorted out.
Well, as you say, a turning point for the forces, I would expect to. Mark, it's been great to have you on. Be well. Hopefully we'll see you on a golf course at some point in the future.
Thanks a lot, John, and to your viewers, you know, all the best. Take care and stay safe. Cheers.
Thanks.